The morning the old Earl of Ashwick was laid in his coffin, Nora Briggs was still scrubbing the hearth in the east corridor. She had been on her knees since before the house stirred, her hands gray with ash, the cold of the flagstones working up through her skirts and settling into her knees like something permanent. She had not been told to stop. No one came to say the work was done for the day, that the household would observe a pause in its machinery out of respect for the man who had owned it all. The footmen were draping the mirrors in black cloth, their voices low and their faces carefully arranged, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Alderton, was moving through the rooms with a ring of keys at her waist and an expression that permitted no idleness. Nora kept scrubbing. She was 19 years old and had been in service at Ashwick Park for 11 months. She had come from Holt, a small village 20 miles north, where her father had farmed a leased plot until his lungs filled and failed him, and where her mother had sent her south with a bundle of gray wool and a letter of character written by the vicar who had known her since childhood. The character called her steady and hardworking and honest. It did not say she was clever, because the vicar had not thought to notice. Nora had noticed, on her first day, that the ash in the east corridor hearth always turned a faint greenish-gray at the bottom of the pile. She had not been asked to notice. She did not mention it. She kept her observations to herself, as a girl in her position learned to do, and she filed the greenish ash away in the part of her mind where things waited until they were needed. She had noticed other things in 11 months. She had noticed that the old Earl, whose name was Reginald Ashwick, took his evening cordial in the study, and that only one person ever poured it. She had noticed that the man who poured it, the Earl's personal secretary, a small, precise man named Mr. Clement Forsyth, kept a locked cabinet beside his desk that no other servant was permitted to approach. She had noticed that the Earl, who had been vigorous enough in October, had grown thin and shaking by Christmas, and that Dr. Fenwick, who came from the market town every fortnight, had twice pronounced him merely fatigued and prescribed port wine and rest. She had noticed that the Earl's heir, his nephew, had arrived in January to discuss the estate's affairs, and that after the nephew's third visit, Mr. Forsyth had begun ordering a particular spice powder from a London apothecary, telling Mrs. Alderton it was for a tincture to ease the old man's stomach. Dr. Fenwick had called the death a natural passage. He had signed the paper. He had folded it, pocketed his fee, and ridden back to town. Nora was still on her knees when she heard the voices from the study below the corridor stairs. Not words exactly, only the shape of voices. The Earl's nephew loud with satisfaction, Mr. Forsyth precise and quick. She did not move from the hearth. She pressed her gray hands flat against the flagstones and breathed through her nose, slowly, the way she had learned to breathe when she needed to think clearly. She was still a scullery maid. She had no station from which to speak. She was, as the housekeeper had told the new footman only 3 days past, nobody in particular. What she held was not station. What she held was the knowledge of the greenish ash and the locked cabinet and the order from the London apothecary and the paper that had signed a death into the record as something it had not been. It would take more than knowledge to be heard. There is something it costs a woman like Nora Briggs to walk the length of a corridor and knock on a door that was never meant to receive her. There is a price in the very act of lifting her hand. If you have ever stood at a threshold you were told was not yours, you will know something of what that cost her. The new Earl had arrived the previous afternoon, not the nephew who visited in winter, but another man entirely. James Ashwick, the legitimate son of the late Earl's elder brother, the rightful heir who had been in India these past 6 years, settling his father's commercial affairs, was only now returned. He had arrived in a hired post-chaise, dusty from the road, with a manner that the house had not yet decided what to make of. He was not loud. He was not expansive. He was tall and quiet, and he walked through the rooms of his inheritance with the flat, careful attention of a man cataloging damage. Mrs. Alderton had told the upper staff, and the upper staff had told the lower staff, that the new Earl was an unknown quantity, which was her way of saying, proceed with caution, and do not attract notice. Nora had attracted notice anyway. She had gone to him at 6 o'clock in the evening, the day after the old Earl was coffined. She had washed her hands and smoothed her cap, and stood outside the study door, and knocked 3 times, even, steady, before her courage could unmake itself. He had opened the door himself, which was not what she expected. James Ashwick was 33 years old, and he had his father's height, without his father's ease, and eyes the color of pale birchwood in winter, which was to say a gray so faint it was almost colorless. He looked at her the way he had been looking at every room in the house, with assessment rather than welcome. "You are not Mrs. Alderton," he said. "No, my lord. I am the scullery maid in the east corridor." She had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it in the ash and the cold all day. "I have information I believe you require. About your uncle's death." He did not dismiss her. He stepped aside, which was the thing that undid all of her preparation, and she had to walk into the room without the armor of the door between them. The study was still arranged as the old Earl had left it, the secretary's desk in the far corner, the locked cabinet beside it. Nora's eyes went to the cabinet before she could stop them. She saw James Ashwick notice that her eyes went there. "Tell me," he said, not unkindly. So she told him. The greenish ash, the spice powder from London, which she had looked up in Mrs. Alderton's household receipts book and found no entry for, the locked cabinet, the 3 visits from the nephew in January, the timing of the Earl's deterioration. She told it in the order it had happened, without embellishment, the way she had arranged it in her mind across 11 months of early mornings and ash and cold. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. His gaze settled somewhere above the locked cabinet, and his jaw held the slight tension of a man considering a weight. "You have carried this for some time," he said. "Since December, my lord. Why did you not go to Dr. Fenwick?" She looked at her hands, which were clean now but still faintly gray at the knuckles. "Dr. Fenwick was paid by the estate, my lord. Mr. Forsyth managed the estate accounts." He was quiet again. Then he said, "What is your name?" "Nora Briggs." She was dismissed shortly after, not coldly, but with the precise formality of a man who needed to think without an audience. She went back to her corner of the servants' hall and sat with her supper growing cold in front of her, and the particular hollow feeling of having spent a thing you could not get back. She did not know what he would do with it. She did not know if he believed her. She did not know if it would matter that she had spoken, or if she had simply made herself visible in a way that would cost her the position she could not afford to lose. What she did not know was that James Ashwick had already written a letter before she reached the servants' hall, addressed to a magistrate in the county seat, and that he had sent it by fast rider before the household had finished dinner. She learned this the next morning, when the magistrate's party arrived before 8 o'clock, and the study was sealed, and Mr. Forsyth was asked to remain in the house pending inquiries. She did not learn it from the Earl. She learned it from Agnes, the lady's maid, who had heard it from the second footman, who had been awake early enough to see the riders come. "The new lord sent for them last night," Agnes said, threading her needle through a seam. "Fast rider, they say. Must have had reason to doubt the doctor's paper." Nora ate her porridge and said nothing. The examinations took 4 days, A physician from London arrived on the third day with instruments Nora had never seen, and Mr. Forsyth's cabinet was opened by a locksmith from the village, and what was inside it did not require a physician to understand. The London apothecary's records were requested. The nephew's correspondence with Mr. Forsyth, preserved in a leather folder in the cabinet, was reviewed by men who were paid to read such things. On the fourth day, the nephew arrived, having received some message that brought him to the house in apparent haste. And on the fourth day, the nephew left again in a different manner than he had arrived, accompanied by 2 men from the magistrate's party, and with none of the ease he had worn in January. Nora was carrying coals from the cellar when they passed her in the back passage. The nephew looked at her once. She kept her eyes level and walked on. She was called to speak to the magistrate on the 5th day in the small library off the east sitting room, with the magistrate's clerk at a desk in the corner and the morning light coming in cold through the tall windows. The magistrate was a compact older gentleman named Mr. Hargreaves, who had the habit of looking at his hands while he listened rather than at the person speaking, which Nora found easier than she had expected. She told it again, as she had told it to the Earl, in order, without embellishment. The clerk's pen moved across his paper in a dry, continuous scratch. The magistrate's eyes remained on his hands during most of it, which she had decided was a habit of concentrated listening rather than dismissal. He was the kind of man who gathered information without indicating whether he found it credible, and she respected that about him without finding it comfortable. The magistrate asked 3 precise questions, each of which she answered without hesitation, because she had only what she had actually seen, and she did not try to add to it. The first question concerned the specific dates on which she had observed the ash. The second concerned who else had access to the east corridor in the mornings before the household stirred. The third concerned the sequence in which she had made her observations over the 11 months. And she answered it as she had answered the Earl, in the order it had happened, beginning in January with the locked cabinet, and ending in February with the botanical volume. And the clerk's pen moved steadily throughout. When it was over, Mr. Hargreaves looked up from his hands and said, "You have been very clear, Miss Briggs, the kind of witness a court finds useful." She did not know what to do with that. She thanked him and went back to the east corridor. The household had taken on the quality of something suspended. The servants moved more quietly than usual and spoke less, and Mrs. Alderton had the look of a woman recalibrating every certainty she had held. Mr. Forsyth had been removed from the premises. The study remained sealed. The ordinary machinery of the house continued, fireplaces cleaned, meals prepared, lamps trimmed, because the house did not stop for moral weather any more than it stopped for rain. What the household could not quite settle was what to make of Nora Briggs. She was still a scullery maid. She had not been elevated. She had not been thanked publicly or promoted or moved to a more visible position in the hierarchy that Mrs. Alderton managed with the same precision she applied to the linen inventory. She was, as she had always been, the girl at the east corridor hearth. The second footman, a cheerful young man named Thomas, asked her outright one evening at supper what she had said to the magistrate. "Only what I knew," she said. "You knew a great deal," he said. There was admiration in it, and something else. A kind of revised attention, as though he were seeing her for the first time in the place she had always occupied. The lady's maid Agnes, who had been at Ashwick Park for 9 years, and held a carefully calibrated position in the servants' hall, said to the cook 3 days after the magistrate's party departed, "The scullery maid is getting above herself, I expect." The cook, a broad, practical woman named Mrs. Hale, said nothing, which was her way of disagreeing. What Nora had become, in the eyes of the household she lived inside, was a problem of category. She was not the kind of woman the house knew how to place now. She had done a thing the house had no framework for, and in the absence of a framework, the household defaulted to its established one. She was still nobody in particular. The girl with the ash on her hands. The one who slept at the far end of the servants' corridor and came down first in the mornings. She had expected this. She had not told the Earl because she expected to be elevated. She had told him because the alternative was to have carried it in silence. And she had already been carrying it since December, and her spine was beginning to curve under the weight of it. She was not ready, though, for what came next. 11 days after the magistrate's party departed, and 4 days after James Ashwick had walked every room of the house with his steward taking notes, the Earl sent word through Mrs. Alderton that he wished to speak with Nora Briggs in the library at 10 o'clock. Mrs. Alderton delivered this message with an expression that had been carefully assembled to show nothing. "Tidy yourself," she said. It was not unkind. It was the nearest thing to preparation she could offer. The library at Ashwick Park ran the length of the East Wing's second floor, floor-to-ceiling shelves of dark walnut, a fire already lit against the November chill. The long table down the center cleared now of the account books the steward had been working through for the past fortnight. James Ashwick was standing at the far window when she entered, looking out at the park where the oaks had shed their leaves and stood gray against the pale sky. He turned when he heard her. He was in plain dark clothes, a dark coat without ornament, and the quality of morning light through the window behind him made his face hard to read from the doorway. "Miss Briggs," he said. "Come in." She came in. She stood at a correct distance from the table and did not clasp her hands, though her hands wanted to find each other. "I have spoken at length with Mr. Hargreaves," he said, "and with the solicitor, and with the physician from London. What you identified in December, and chose to report to me when the opportunity presented itself, has been confirmed as material in the proceedings against Mr. Forsyth and my cousin." He paused. His tone was precise, but there was something underneath the precision. Something careful, like a man walking ground he was not certain of. "The household might have allowed an injustice to stand. You did not." She waited. There was more. She could feel it in the way he had not yet said the thing he had asked her here to say. "I am aware of what it cost you to speak," he said. "The risk of your position. The risk of being disbelieved." He turned slightly, so the window light caught the side of his face, and she saw that the careful quality she had mistaken for coldness was in fact the opposite, a man accustomed to containing a great deal. "I am told you have been in service at Ashwick Park for 11 months. I am told you came from Holt. I am told your father died 2 years ago, and that your mother has 2 younger sisters still at home." She had not thought he would know that. The knowledge of it made something in her chest tighten. "Mrs. Alderton has recommended you for a position as parlor maid, which is a reasonable advancement. I mean to offer you more than that." The fire settled. A coal shifted and threw a brief orange light along the shelf spines. "I have need of a household secretary," he said. "The position has been vacant since Mr. Forsyth's removal, and given what the last man in that position did with his access to the estate's affairs, I find I would rather have someone in it whose capacity for observation I have already had occasion to test." He was looking at her directly now, pale eyes level and without condescension. "It is an unconventional appointment. You would require tuition in the administrative aspects of the work, which can be arranged. The position carries a salary of £40 per annum, a separate room, and an elevation in your standing in the household that would be permanent, regardless of any future change in circumstance." Nora did not speak immediately. The fire spoke instead, the wood ticking and settling, and outside the window a crow called once, and was silent. "You are surprised," he said. "I am," she said. It came out more honest than she intended. Something moved in his face. It was not amusement. Precisely. It was nearer to recognition, the expression of a man who had found, unexpectedly, what he had thought the world did not contain. "I have been making decisions on insufficient information for 6 years," he said. "I find I prefer accurate intelligence to flattery. You have demonstrated that you can produce the first and have no patience for the second." She should have been grateful and modest. She should have thanked him and accepted with the proper deference and said nothing further. She was not built, precisely, for the proper deference. "May I ask a question, my lord?" He indicated that she might. "The position," she said. "You are offering it because of what I observed, or because you believe I am capable of the work?" He did not hesitate. "Both," he said, "and I would not distinguish between them. A woman who spent 11 months observing the administration of this household's corruption while still in the lowest position in it has already been doing the work. She has simply not been compensated for it." The fire settled again. Nora breathed once, deliberately. "I accept," she said. What followed was not simple. Nothing that changes a woman's condition in a house is ever simple. There were 3 weeks of Mrs. Alderton adjusting her understanding of the household's order, the particular adjustment a careful woman makes when a category she has held firm is required to expand. There was Agnes's coldness, precise and cutting, the kind that does not announce itself as coldness, but only as a slightly increased formality of address and a slight tendency to look past rather than at. There was Thomas's open warmth, which was easier to carry. There was the matter of the tuition, which James Ashwick arranged by inviting his solicitor, Mr. Colby, to review estate administration with Nora 2 mornings per week in the library, working through the ledgers and the correspondence processes and the management of the household's accounts in the manner that Mr. Forsyth had corrupted them. Nora sat across from Mr. Colby with a pen and a sheet of paper and took down notes in the clear, small hand she had taught herself from her father's almanacs, and Mr. Colby, who had expected to find the exercise tedious, found himself repeatedly disconcerted by the speed with which she identified an anomaly in a figure or a gap in a procedural chain. He mentioned this to James Ashwick, not as praise exactly, but as a professional observation that bore on the usefulness of the appointment. James Ashwick said, "Yes," and let the syllable close on itself without further elaboration, which was his way of indicating that he had already known. They began to work alongside each other more often than the position strictly required, not by deliberate arrangement, but by the natural motion of 2 people engaged in the same task who found it easier to think in proximity than in separation. She brought him questions she had encountered in the accounts. He answered them without making her feel the gap in their respective educations. She returned to the questions the next day with her own answers already formed, having worked them through in the night. And she presented the answers, and he considered them, and said, 4 times out of 5, that she was correct. He had been at sea for 3 weeks in a violent storm off the coast of Ceylon 6 years ago, and the experience had rearranged his understanding of which things were essential and which were merely conventional. He had survived it alongside 2 sailors and a Ceylonese merchant with whom he still corresponded. He had come home to find his father dead and his inheritance complicated, and the English domestic conventions he had grown up inside feeling rather less fixed than he had once assumed them to be. He did not explain any of this to Nora in so many words. He told her about the merchant. One afternoon in late November when they were working through the correspondence for the estate's tenant farmers, because the merchant had a quality of direct attention that he had been trying unsuccessfully to describe to people for 6 years and had now encountered again. And it seemed relevant. She asked 3 questions about Ceylon. He answered them, and the hour passed without either of them noticing. This was the 3rd week of her appointment. She was still adjusting to the room she had been given, which was small but faced east, and received the morning light through its single window, and to the sensation of waking in the dark, without immediately calculating whether the day's cold would make the flagstones worse. She was adjusting to the weight of the pen in her hand across a long morning of accounts. The particular ache of work that used a different part of her than scrubbing had used. She had not adjusted to the quality of James Ashwick's attention. He was not a demonstrative man. He did not offer opinions about her person or her situation, beyond the immediate professional. He did not single her out in company for attention, nor arrange the household's daily order so that their paths crossed more than the work required. If he was aware of the way Mrs. Alderton's eyes tracked the proximity between them during the Thursday account reviews, he gave no sign of it. If he noticed that Thomas had taken to making sure the library fire was banked higher on the mornings she was known to work there, he did not mention it. He was courteous in a way that was precise rather than warm, the courtesy of a man who had learned to be careful with people rather than one who found them easy. He did not notice her, in the particular way a man in his position was not supposed to notice a woman in hers, and she was grateful for it, because if he had, she would not have been able to work alongside him, and she needed to be able to work alongside him. Only sometimes, at the edge of some professional exchange, in the half-second before he returned his attention to the papers between them, she caught something in the set of his face that she could not name. A stillness that was not the stillness of blankness. A quality of holding. She put it away in the part of her mind where things waited until they were needed. He had a wound. She knew it the way she had known about the ash, by accumulation rather than revelation. There were small things. A sealed letter that arrived twice in February from an address in Calcutta, and that he set aside without opening, and that was gone from his desk the next morning, folded away somewhere she did not ask about. A habit he had of touching the fourth finger of his left hand with his thumb, briefly when he thought no one was observing, the way a man touches a place that was once marked and is now not. The gallery portrait of the young woman in the pale dress, with steady dark eyes. The deliberateness of his not looking told her more than looking at the portrait itself would have told her. There had been a woman, she thought, before India. There was a portrait in the gallery that he passed without looking at, a young woman in a pale dress with steady dark eyes, and the deliberateness of his not looking told her more than looking at the portrait itself would have told her. She did not ask. She had not earned the right to ask, and she was not sure she would have asked even if she had earned it, because some griefs were not hers to touch. The proceedings against Mr. Forsyth and the nephew, whose name was Reginald Ashwick the younger, and whose confidence in his own scheme had been its primary flaw, moved forward through December and into January. Nora was called to provide a written statement, which Mr. Colby assisted her in framing correctly, and which she revised twice before she was satisfied that it said precisely what she had observed and nothing that she had merely inferred. Mr. Hargreaves sent a note to James Ashwick in January commending the quality of the statement. James Ashwick set the note on her desk when she came in the next morning without comment, and she read it and set it to one side, and they resumed the work. She had begun, in the evenings, to sit by the library fire and read. He had told her when she was first appointed that the library was available to her in the off-hours, a thing Mrs. Alderton had received in tight-lipped silence. Nora read the history volumes first, finding them familiar in their structure, the same kind of accumulation of evidence she already knew how to manage. She worked toward the natural philosophy section in February, and in late February she found a volume on botanical compounds and their effects on the body, published in 1793. And she sat very still with it in her lap for an hour before she put it back in its place on the shelf. It confirmed what she had already known. The greenish ash. The particular compound used in small quantities over a long period. She had been right in December, and she had sat on the knowledge because she was nobody in particular. She had been right, and the man had continued to deteriorate for 3 months because she had not had a way to be believed. This was the thing she could not entirely put down, not grief precisely, something quieter and more patient and harder to resolve. She had been right, and she had been without recourse, and those two conditions together produced something she did not have a word for in any language she knew. She had been right in December, and she had continued to carry coals and clean ash and sleep at the far end of the servants' corridor and say nothing, and the old Earl had continued to thin and shake and drink his poisoned cordial at the hands of a man who called it a tincture. And in February she had found the botanical volume and confirmed that she had been right all along. And right had not been enough. Right had required the intervention of a man whose door she could knock on. And she was grateful for that door. And she was also clear-eyed about what it meant that the door had been necessary. James Ashwick found her there, beside the returned volume on the shelf, with the fire behind her and the February dark at the window. He had come to retrieve a ledger and had stopped in the doorway when he saw her face. He did not ask what she was thinking. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the shelf, and she was aware of him at a distance of perhaps 2 feet. The particular quality of warmth and solidity that close proximity to another person carries, and she did not move away from it. "The compound is confirmed in the volume," she said. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the spine of the book. "I found it in December by another route." "I know," he said. 3 months passed." "Yes." His voice was level, but there was something in it, something that knew the weight of 3 months in a way that went beyond the professional. "I have thought about those 3 months a great deal." She turned her head. He was closer than she had registered, and his face at this distance showed the thing she had seen at the edge of professional exchanges, the controlled quality, the contained quantity of whatever it was he was holding. His eyes, pale and specific in the firelight, were on the side of her face, and then, when she turned, on her face directly. "Nora," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. It was not a summons. It was, she understood suddenly, a threshold. The deliberate naming of a person in a way that named everything else at the same time. Her heart was in her throat. Her hands were entirely still. She had learned stillness at the hearth in the east corridor, the ability to hold without moving, and she held it now though the rest of her was doing something the stillness could not quite contain. "I am going to ask you something," he said, "and I would prefer you to answer as you answer everything, which is to say without softening it." "Yes," she said. "I have been back at Ashwick Park for 4 months. I have not been at ease in a house since I left England 6 years ago, which I had attributed to the particular difficulty of inheriting under these circumstances." The words came out carefully, as though he had considered each one before permitting it. "I find I am unable to attribute it to that entirely." She looked at him. She did not look away. "I am asking," he said, "whether you would consent to allow me to know you better than the work requires. I am asking it in full knowledge of every convention that argues against it, and with the understanding that if your answer is no, the work continues as it has, and nothing between us changes in any professional respect." The fire behind her threw light along the shelf, along the spines of the books she had been working her way through for 3 months, along the side of his face, patient and unguarded. She had not been guarded for some time. She had stopped being guarded, she thought, sometime around the letter to the county magistrate, when she had understood that he had believed her immediately, and without requiring her to prove herself twice. "I would consent to that," she said. Something went out of his face. Not the control, but the effort of maintaining it. What remained was something quieter and more real. He did not reach for her. He stood at his 2 feet of distance, and the fire talked behind them, and the February dark pressed against the window glass, and the thing between them was acknowledged, which was sufficient. More than sufficient. What came after was slow and proper, and conducted within the constraints of the house's order, which were real constraints and which they both observed, and which were also, as Nora had understood since December, negotiable. Everything the house called fixed had turned out to be negotiable. The question was only who was willing to negotiate it, and what they were willing to offer in exchange. The announcement came in March, when the daffodils were up along the kitchen garden wall, and the proceedings against Mr. Forsyth had reached their formal conclusion. James Ashwick told Mrs. Alderton before he told the rest of the house, because Mrs. Alderton had a right to the information in her capacity as housekeeper, and because he was a man who believed in the proper sequence of things. Mrs. Alderton received it in silence, and then said that she hoped Miss Briggs would find the position satisfactory. He told her that he believed she would. The household assembly happened on a Thursday morning in the main hall, with the fire lit and the staff gathered as they were gathered for formal announcements of any kind. James Ashwick stood at the head of the hall, and Nora stood to his left, which was not where the household secretary usually stood, and the house understood immediately what the arrangement meant, because houses always know before the words arrive. Agnes stood in the second rank of the household staff with Lady Cecily Vane, the neighbor who had come to call and had been invited to remain, and Agnes's face was arranged with a careful precision that was the nearest she could manage to neutrality. "I am to be married," James Ashwick said, "to Miss Nora Briggs, who has served this household with a degree of integrity I have not previously encountered, and whose counsel has been of more material benefit to the estate in 4 months than any equivalent period in recent memory." Lady Cecily's fan was still in her hand. She had stopped moving it when the arrangement of the principals registered, and she did not move it now. Agnes said quietly, to no one in particular, "The scullery maid." Mrs. Alderton, who was standing behind Agnes, said, "The household secretary, if you please." The cook, Mrs. Hale, who was standing to the left of Mrs. Alderton, said nothing, which was her way of being satisfied. Thomas, the footman, who was standing near the door to the kitchen passage, was smiling in a way he did not trouble to conceal. Nora stood at James Ashwick's left side in her best gray wool dress, which was not fine, and was aware of the weight of Agnes's gaze and Lady Cecily's arrested fan and the long line of faces that were reassembling their understanding of her, and she did not look at any of them. She looked at the hall, the high ceiling and the dark oak paneling, and the fire in the grate, which she had cleaned for 11 months, and which she had come to know in the way you know the particular cold of a room in the mornings before anyone else is awake. The hall was hers now, in a way she was still understanding. Not hers the way a possession is owned. Hers the way a place is known. James Ashwick turned his head and looked at her, and she looked back at him. And the thing in his face was the same thing she had first seen at the edge of professional exchanges, the contained quality, only now it was not contained. It was offered. She offered it back. There was no applause, because this was not a theater. There was the fire, and the oak, and the particular silence of a house that has just received information it will spend the next several years processing. And outside the window the daffodils moved in a thin March wind along the kitchen garden wall. The license was obtained in April. The vicar who performed the ceremony was the same vicar who had written Nora's character letter from Holt, the one that called her steady and hard-working and honest, but had not thought to mention that she was clever. He noted after the ceremony that she appeared very well. She thanked him and returned to the carriage. They were home before the light failed. The house was lit when they arrived, Mrs. Alderton having ensured that every room that mattered was warm, and that the table was set, and that the household presented itself with the particular pride of a staff that has decided to claim the new order as its own. Nora stood in the entrance hall and allowed the familiar smell of it, coal smoke and beeswax and the cold from the park coming in behind them, to settle around her, and the hall was quiet, and the fire in the grate threw its orange light along the floor. And she was home. James Ashwick was 2 steps behind her, and she heard him stop, and she turned. He was looking at her in the entrance hall with the expression she had first seen in the library in February, the unguarded one, and he held out his hand, not a command, and not a question that required an answer. She put her hand in his. The house held them, and the fire held its light. And outside the kitchen garden wall, the daffodils were still. If this was the story Nora Briggs was waiting to know she was already living, we are glad she said it aloud. We are glad she kept her eyes open in the east corridor at dawn. We are glad she knocked on that door. The hall was quiet. The fire was warm. Outside the window, the long April evening was pale and golden, the sky that particular shade of English spring that makes everything it touches look as though it has always belonged there. Nora Briggs had always belonged here. The house had simply not known to say so